I want to start right now with comments that were made earlier by yourself as well as Secretary Ross that there could potentially be, should the president enact his trade proposals, exemptions for other countries. What would a country have to do, Mr. Secretary, to qualify for such an exemption?
So the president has already made clear that it relates to Mexico and Canada, that to the extent we have a new NAFTA agreement with them, that they will be exempted from the steel and aluminum tariffs. So I'm not going to comment on other countries. It would be premature. But obviously, Canada, we have a very close relationship in terms of steel going back and forth, and that's something that we're focused on.
With regards to timing of this announcement, is it logical to think that we could get an announcement this week?
That is the plan, yes.
So as early as tomorrow?
It could be as early as tomorrow. It could be Friday. We're working to get the finishing documents on this.
When you look at the response from folks around the world, and let's start there, from China as well as the European Union, who have criticized this, who have said that they would file complaints. Some have already filed complaints. What's your response to those criticisms from those particular countries?
So first I would say, let's just put this in perspective. So the president has been very clear. This has been since the campaign. This has been since his presidency on what his economic agenda is. And we've talked about constantly it is a three-tiered. It's tax reform, regulatory relief, and trade. So we got tax reform done. I think a lot of people question whether we got that done. It took 30 years since the last time. We've already seen the economic benefits of tax reform. We've done a lot of work in terms of regulatory relief. We're looking forward to hopefully the new Dodd-Frank bill passing on a bipartisan basis. I think that's a big step in the right direction for community banks, regional banks being able to grow. And we've been talking about trade for the last year. So since my first G20 finance ministers meeting, we've been talking about trade. So everything we're doing here has been in discussion. The president is concerned about the national security risk as it relates to steel and aluminum. Secretary Ross has been working on that report. We've been having discussions with people. So this is a natural evolution of what the president's economic policies are.
So what about then when House Speaker Paul Ryan says, like he did the other day, that he's advocating for a more quote-unquote surgical approach with regards to these trade policies? Is he going to be satisfied this week when this announcement is complete? Is this going to be a more surgical approach like the Republicans on Capitol Hill have advocated for?
Well, again, I think it's somewhere in between. So, and I think, look, the president wants to take on the trade issue. It's a very important economic issue. As you know, China's market is not open to our companies and our workers the way our markets are open for them. The president believes in free and fair trade, but he wants reciprocal trade and reciprocal fair deals. And that's why when we go forward with the 232, there is a mechanism that will be able to deal with these issues.
I want to follow up with something that President Trump tweeted earlier today about intellectual property, especially as we're nearing the end of NAFTA renegotiations in particular. A lot of this, some would argue that China has a backdoor access through Mexico and Canada and is using the NAFTA agreement to kind of infiltrate those markets. Is that something that you would like to see improved, or this administration would like to see improved with regards to these final negotiations?
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the big issues we have of things that come into the United States through, in particular, Mexico, whether it's autos, auto parts, other things. But this is a big issue for the president and something that we're focused on as part of the renegotiations. But again, let me just put this in context. NAFTA is an old agreement. We have very important trading relationships with Canada and Mexico. But the president wants to look at this agreement and wants a better deal for American workers and American companies. That's what this is all about, more fair and balanced trade.
So with regards to trade, in particular China, it's really no secret, Mr. Secretary, that China has been taking advantage of the aluminum and steel markets here in the United States for quite some time. They have called this policy, an economic minister, a quote-unquote stupid idea to some extent. And the relationship, they have called for a point person within the administration to be the trade person with regards to U.S.-China policy. What's your response to the Chinese?
Sure. So first of all, and again, I just want to put this in context. I think President Trump and President Xi have the best relationship of any two presidents in the history of the two countries. And President Trump, from the first time we met at Mar-a-Lago, was very direct in We're concerned about the trade deficit. And the Chinese and President Xi acknowledged that and said it's in our mutual interest to have a more balanced trading relationship. So from a high level, we absolutely have agreements. I've had many dialogues with my counterparts. I saw Liu He when I was in Davos. I saw him last week when he was here. We met with him over a 2-day period. We're having very direct discussions with them about how to deal with these issues. So again, I think that we've been very clear in what our objectives are, and now we've got to figure out if there's a way we can work together to meet these objectives.
One of the issues that I find interesting with regards to the tariff debate that's going on is who exactly it would help. And it's been interesting to watch some of the Republicans in Congress criticize the policy proposal. But some in the energy sector have risen concerns about how this would raise the cost of energy infrastructure throughout the country, particularly the cost of building pipelines. To folks who say this could end up raising costs, or to folks who say that this might hurt economic growth, and they cite that as a concern, some of them even Republicans, what's your response to them who feel that these tariffs could ultimately offset some of the economic gains that have been made as a result of tax policy?
Well, we have a big economic team that's working on this between Treasury, the White House, U.S. Trade, Commerce, the CEA. We have a big team that's working on this. So we've looked at these issues. We've looked at them very carefully. But on the other hand, the issue is, again, we have unfair trade deals, and the president is determined that we look at these and we renegotiate these so that they're good for American business.
You mentioned the team, but someone's leaving that team, Gary Cohn. The market didn't like that. They reacted negatively to that. What hole will he leave in this administration's economic team?
Gary's been a terrific partner. I've known Gary, obviously, for a long period of time, since my time at Goldman Sachs. Gary was very important in many things we did here. But there's a big economic team, and we'll be replacing Gary at some point. And there's a lot of people who are working together and will continue to work together. So we will miss him. We wish him well, but we're going to move forward.
All right, now I got to get into who's it going to be. Any timetable? Let's start there. Any timetable for when we could get a named successor?
I don't think we have a timetable like all these other issues. We'll carefully review it. We'll make recommendations to the president, and he'll decide.
Some of those recommendations are Kevin Hassett, Jim Donovan, Larry Kudlow, Peter Navarro. Any of these names? Can I get any sense of who's on the short list for this role?
Well, as you recall, when we were looking at Fed chairs, you tried the same thing. And as you recall, I was pretty clear in that we're not going to talk about confidential issues.
No names.
But I do want to go back to one other issue when you talk about growth. A year ago, we were sitting at 2% GDP. And lots of people lined up and said, we'd never get to 3% GDP.
That's true.
We've said all along, our goal is to have 3% sustained GDP. We've had 2 quarters of it. We're not there on a constant basis yet. But the president is very focused on growth. That is our number one objective.
And let me ask you a follow-up just in terms of who this policy, should he ultimately go with this trade policy pitch. He's headed to southwestern Pennsylvania ahead of a special election there in particular. Does this administration feel that Americans are going to actually, his supporters will rally behind this proposal?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that Americans understand that the president is for free trade, but free and fair trade. And he wants to get good deals. He's the salesman in chief for American business.
Let's move on, just while we're on the list of potential names. Any timing update on when we will get a name for the Federal Reserve Vice Chair?
We're working on that. Again, I think it's something that will be in the near future. As you know, there's a process that people go through even once we make a recommendation to the president for background checks and everything else. So it's unfortunately a lengthy process. But
have you made that recommendation?
I'm not going to comment specifically, but I can tell you there's a lot of work that's gone on that.
All right, another big issue up on Capitol Hill is Dodd-Frank. You mentioned it. You mentioned deregulatory reform. 11, I believe, Democratic senators have signed on to the community banking Dodd-Frank bill that is scheduled to advance, if not this week, out of the Senate early next week. This is something that this administration supports, no? But
absolutely. And, we've worked very closely with Congress on this. A lot of these things are similar to the recommendations that we made and the reports that we delivered to the president. And again, I think the most important issue is we believe in regulation, but we need to have proper and prudent regulation. And as it relates to this, we need to make sure that community banks and regional banks can grow, can lend. That's the engine of growth for our economy, lending to small and medium-sized businesses.
When Democrats like Senator Elizabeth Warren say that this is just only going to help the big banks, that this is just going to let some banks that have been, community banks even, that have been bailed out during the 2008 financial crash, what's your response?
I'm not sure why she feels that way. I don't agree with her on this. Again, I think this is the way bipartisan legislation should work, which has been a compromise, and important issues and well thought out.
After it advances out of the Senate, it'll go to the House. I think there's been like several dozen bipartisan wonkier items that have advanced out of the House. Are there any specifics that you would like to see added to this bill that you guys could get on board with once it clears the Senate?
Well, again, one, we're very supportive of the legislation. We're also supportive of certain issues in the House. I think it likely will go to conference. And again, I think the important thing is this can get over the finish line, which will be good for the economy and good for commercial and regional banks.
And then after that, what's next? Is it infrastructure? Is it reforming the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau? What's the next big item for the administration from an economic FinReg perspective?
Well, from my perspective, from Treasury's perspective, the other piece of legislation we're working very closely with Senator Cohn is on FIRMA, which is basically upgrading CFIUS and CFIUS reform. I believe that this is very important for national security and very important for everything we're doing. So we're hopeful that that'll get through. I think, as you know, we've talked about housing reform. I'm not sure that's something that will get done this summer before the elections, but we are determined to try to get Fannie and Freddie restructured in some format so that we don't put taxpayers at risk. And as you know, we're very focused here at Treasury working closely with the IRS on the implementation of the Tax Jobs Act. So it touches every single aspect of the IRS.
We've got about a minute or two left, but on the issue of tax reform in particular, there's been some chatter, and I'm really interested to get your take on this, that there could even be an additional bill later this year with tweaks to the tax reform or even more. Even I think President Trump had said it in one of his speeches that he would like to see more this year before the midterms. Is that actually in the works?
It may be. So what I would say is there's a lot that we can do on regulations. There's a few items that may need to go through a technical corrections bill. And then I think the president is interested in looking at, what are things that we could continue to do afterwards and move forward.
Bottom line, this week, when there's a new trade tariff policy announced, what is the reaction going to be from the markets, number one, but Republicans? Is there going to be satisfaction, or is it going to be a lot of criticism, like, quite frankly, we've seen all week?
Well, I'm not going to comment on where the markets are in the short term. As you know, there's a lot of volatility. There's no question the market is still up a ton since the election, which is reflective of the president's economic agenda. And I think America is a great place to invest. So over the long term, I still think there's tremendous upside in the market.